Your vendor just emailed you their SOC2 Type II report. You opened it, you saw a clean opinion on the cover page, you said looks good, and you approved them. Here's the problem. That's exactly what high-risk vendors count on. A SOC2 report is not a security certificate. It's not a pass or fail exam. It's a document that tells a very specific story. And if you don't know how to read it, you will miss the part of that story that actually matters. I'm going to walk you through this report section by section and show you exactly what to look for, what to ignore, and what should stop you cold. So by the end of this video, you will never look at the SOC2 report the same way again. Let's go to page 7, where you will see the auditor's opinion. Right here in section 2, this is a section where everyone reads first. And ironically, it's the least useful section of the entire report. Here's why. The auditor's opinion tells you whether the controls the vendor described are operating as described. That's it. It does not tell you whether those controls are the right controls for your business. It does not tell you whether those controls cover your specific data, and it absolutely does not tell you whether the vendor is actually secure. Think about it this way. Imagine I hire a building inspector, and I get to tell the inspector which rooms they're allowed to look at. That's essentially what SOC2 audit is. The vendor selects what goes into scope, hires an auditor they're paying, and the auditor evaluates what the vendor told them to evaluate. So on page 6, you will see the scope language. The auditor is examining the description that vendor prepared. The description the vendor wrote about themselves. This is not an independent investigation. This is a structured review of what the vendor chose to present. So when you see the auditor's opinion on page 7, which confirms the vendor's controls were designed and operating effectively based on what they described, that's what that actually means. The controls they described appear to be operating as they described them, nothing more. The real information is in sections 1, 3, and 4. That's where we're going to go next. So that would be page 4. The very first thing I look at is when I receive the SOC2 report, and before I read a single word of the content is the audit period. Right here on page 4, you could see the date range, which tells me how much of this report I could actually trust. Here is the rule. A SOC2 report should be no more than 12 months old. If a vendor sends you a report 18 months from the end of the last audit period, or if the report is 2 years old, that is a red flag. Their environment has changed. Their personnel might have changed. Their sub-processors have likely changed. That report describes a company that may not exist in its current form anymore. So now look at the length of the audit period itself. This report covers a full 12 months, January to December. That's what you want to see. So if the vendor sends you a report that only covers 3 months, that's technically a SOC2 Type II report, but it barely qualifies. 3 months of testing does not really give you meaningful evidence that controls are operating consistently. So you should ask yourself, why did they only audit 3 months? Was this their first audit? Did they rush to get compliant for a specific client? Was that short window specifically chosen to avoid a period where something went wrong? And the second thing to watch for is something called a bridge letter. A bridge letter is a separate document from the vendor that says, our audit ended 10 months ago. But here is our statement that nothing significant has changed since then. So bridge letter is not an evidence, but it's the vendor pinky promising their environment is still the same. If a vendor is handling, handing you a year-old report plus a bridge letter instead of scheduling a new audit, that tells you something about how seriously they take compliance. Short audit window, stale report, or a bridge letter in place of current report, any of these is a documented risk finding, so you should write it down. Okay, let's go to page 9 real quick. Section 3. So this is a description of systems. Most people skip this section because it's long and it looks like marketing copy. You should not skip it. Okay. This section tells you exactly what is in scope and what's important for this audit. It covers the vendor's infrastructure, software, people, data, and most importantly, what they're not responsible for. Here's what you are actually reading for. Are the things that matter to you in scope? Okay. Look at this. The vendor has named specific data center locations. Okay. And specific hardware vendors. That level of specificity is actually a good sign. It tells you the vendor actually did the work to describe their real environment accurately. Normally, the red flag version you will see in the real world is 3 paragraphs of like vague language about industry standard infrastructure and leading cloud providers with no names, no locations, no specifics. That is a templated description. Someone basically filled in a form. That tells you the vendor may have put more effort into getting the badge than into the actual audit itself. Okay. Now look at this section, customer responsibilities. This is where the vendor tells you what they are not responsible for. It says that any customer-initiated changes to servers, services, or logical access entitlements are exclusively the customer's responsibility. Customer-initiated server maintenance is excluded from the scope of this report entirely. This is not buried in fine print. It is literally in the system description. But most people reviewing a SOC 2 report never make it this far. So you should write it down, all of the information in the customer responsibility section, since every item on that list is a risk that lives in your organization and not theirs. Okay. So let's skip to page 26. The next most important section here. Applicable trust services principles, criteria, and CCM criteria. So let me explain what this section actually is before we dive in, because the title is mouthful and most people's eyes glaze over it immediately. This section is auditor's testing log. It is the record of every single security and availability control the vendor claimed to have, and whether those controls actually worked when the auditor tested them. Think of it as a car inspection report. Section 1 is the car owner saying, my car is in great shape. Section 2 is the mechanic saying, I looked at it. Section 4 is the actual checklist of every system the mechanic tested and what they found. This is where the truth is. So look at this table on page 27. There are 4 columns. The first column is the control ID, just the reference number. The second column is what the vendor is required to do, the standards they're being measured against. The third column is what the vendor says they actually do to meet that standard. And the fourth column is one where, on the far right, labeled results of tests, is what the auditor found when they went and actually checked. So that fourth column is the only column that matters for your risk decision. In this illustrative report, the results column says no exceptions noted for every single control. Here it only shows you 2 controls. But usually it's a long, extensive report with many controls listed. And the good report, of course, will show no exception noted for every single control. And that's what clean report looks like. Clean results, rather. So that means auditor tested every control and it worked exactly as the vendor said it would. No problems found. And that's what you want to see. So now I need to explain what an exception actually is, because this sample report does not have any, but in the real world, you will definitely encounter them. An exception is when the auditor tested a control and it did not work. So the vendor said, we reviewed user access quarterly, the auditor checked, and the quarterly reviews did not happen. That is an exception. The vendor said, we required 2-factor authentication for all remote access. The auditor found 3 accounts without it. That's an exception. So exceptions are failures, not maybes, actual failures of a stated control during the audit period. And here's the critical thing most people miss. A SOC2 report could still receive an unqualified opinion, meaning it passed even with the exceptions present. The auditor makes a judgment call about whether the exceptions are material enough to affect the overall opinion. So you could receive a report that says passed on the cover and still have multiple failed controls buried inside the section 4. This is exactly why you cannot stop at the opinion letter. And then just to mention, if the control did not pass, you will see here, say something, exception noted, and it will give you a short explanation of that exception, of what auditor was able to find. So when you find an exception, ask these 3 questions. Question 1, what control failed? Is this a continuous automated control that runs every day, or a manual control that fires once a quarter? A failure in an automated access monitoring control means there was a window where unauthorized access could have gone undetected. A quarterly access review that was submitted 2 weeks late is still a finding, but the risk is different. Control type determines severity. Question 2, how did management respond? The management response is normally written by the vendor and not the auditor. So the good response identifies the root cause, describes the specific corrective action taken, and confirms retesting. It usually included at the end of the report, right after the description of these test results. It's normally like the last page. So it sounds like it would say like access review was delayed due to a staffing change. We implemented an automated calendar reminder and reran the review. No inappropriate access was identified. This is pretty conclusive. And then the bad response sounds like, we have since remediated this exception and something to that effect. That's it. No specific details. No root cause, no evidence, just we fixed it. So if you see that, ask for evidence of the fix before you approve anything. And then question 3, does this exception affect your data specifically? If the failed control relates to logical access management, who could read or modify data, and your organization's data lives in that system, that exception is directly relevant to you and needs to be escalated. If it relates to physical data center badge access at the facility your data does not touch, it still matters, but the direct exposure is lower. So if you cannot answer what specific exception means for your organization, and you cannot defend in writing why you approve the vendor anyway, you're not doing vendor risk management. You're basically doing vendor checkbox management. So that's a significant difference. Okay, so let's go back to page 12. Here's one more thing I need to show you, and this one surprises people usually every single time. So inside most SOC 2 Type II reports, there's a concept called complementary user entity controls. Or CUECs. Here's what CUECs actually are. They're the controls that the vendor is assuming you are already running on your end. And they're condition of the vendor's own SOC 2 controls working correctly. So look at this diagram on page 12. This is the vendor drawing a box and telling you exactly what is outside of their scope and therefore your responsibility. So client administrator level access management, that means managing who on your team has admin access to this vendor's environment. That is on you. Hypervisor management is also on you. Physical server keys are on you. Other complementary user entity controls are on you. Okay, so this was the last section that I thought was important to go over. And basically that's the SOC 2 deep dive that I wanted to go over and, to show you all of the important section that you should pay more attention at. So now let me show how BizGuard simplifies all of this information in a single decision framework. So here's where you are after receiving a SOC 2 report. So you checked all the audit period, you read the system description, you reviewed section 4 for exceptions, you went through the CUECs, you took notes. Now what? Most people, including compliance teams at larger companies, stop here. They file the report, check a box that says SOC 2 reviewed, and move on. But the actual work is in what comes next. Making a defensible decision. Do you approve this vendor? Do you require remediation first? Do you approve with conditions? Do you walk away? And more importantly, can you explain what decision you need to make to your leadership, your auditor, your clients, if they ask? This is the part where most small businesses and MSPs are completely on their own. If there's no TPRM team, no GRC platform, they can't afford, for example, $500 to $1,500 per vendor assessment from a consultant. That is exactly why I built this BizGuard Light Pro. So I spent 5 years as a vendor risk analyst manually doing this work, reviewing questionnaires, scoring risk, writing justifications, defending decisions to auditors and leadership. Every assessment took hours, and every time the hardest part was not reading the report. It was knowing what to do with what I found. BizGuard Light Pro takes that decision out of your head and puts it into structured framework. So here's the questionnaire that I built. So step one, you sent the vendor the structured questionnaire, which covers data and access, what kind of data they're handling, whether they have PHI or PII access, security controls, encryption, MFAs, incident response, business stability, everything that matters for a vendor risk decision. It is aligned to SOC 2 and ISO 27001 standards. Here is the scoring tab. Their answers feed into the automated scoring engine on the scoring tab, so every question is worth points. The engine calculates the total score as a percentage and assigns a risk tier automatically, low, moderate, or high. No manual math, no guesswork. Okay, and then here is where BizGuard goes beyond a simple score. On the Vendor Risk Report tab, you answer 5 context questions, these 5 questions, about your specific situation, what role this vendor plays in your organization, how critical they are, whether a business associate agreement is in place, BAA, what level of system access they have, and why you're assessing them at this time. Those 5 answers combine with the score to drive the decision engine. Okay, so grade A in the results would be acceptable risk, monitor, strong controls, standard monitoring. If it shows grade B, it is also acceptable with documentation, minor gaps, documentation needed. Grade C would show remediation required. Suggestions, deficiencies require remediation before or after approval. Grade D will show escalation required, executive review required, and do not proceed without a sign-off. The next grade E would suggest to replace at renewal. Replaceable vendor, replace at the next contract renewal. And then the last grade F, it's out of scope, minimal risk, no sensitive data, and no system access. So underneath this outcome, you get specific recommendations. You will see it at a later time when I fill in the questionnaire. They will be automatically generated based on your exact combination of vendor role, their risk tier, and assessment context. It's not a generic advice. The specific actions, timelines, and the next steps for this vendor will be shown in the situation. It is an enterprise level decision and intelligence at a fraction of the cost. This is what saves you 4 or 5 hours per vendor review. This is also what lets you confidently tell a client, an auditor, or your own leadership, here's the risk, and here's the decision, and here's why. So let me show you a real example. So I'm going to run a billing at an EHR vendor called Cario through the BizGuard Light Pro so you could see exactly how this works. Okay, so I already pre-populated the questionnaire so I don't have to take your time. You know, here you complete the client information, their business name, the owner's name, the title, email, and the phone number. And here is the vendor information. I just put the Cario and just a fictitious name, of course, and the email address. I pre-populated the answers of their access and the, data and what the type of businesses they're running. So basically here it's asking all of the basic questions when it comes to security questionnaires. I would say, it's a light questionnaire. It doesn't have 200 questions like SIG, but this is sufficient enough for you to evaluate the vendor based on their access and that type of services they provide. So the first question, will the vendor access, store, or process any company data? We will say yes. The data is not public. Vendor process of store company's internal confidential data, we say yes. They do not access confidential business contracts or pricing plan. Is the data confidential business pricing plan? No. Does the service involve PII or PHI? So it's a identifiable personal data or personal health information, which is the highest sensitivity. We'd say yes, since they do process health information. And will any data be received or processed outside of US? No. They don't access VPN or VDI. They do use subcontractors. They have NDA, and then their MFA, multi-factor authentication, is in effect, and they do use it. So sensitive data is encrypted at rest and in transit. They do use AI, large language models, as part of their service delivery. So I would say yes here, but the client data is not used to train LLM. And then we say that customers can opt out from AI-based data processing. And the last few questions, do employees receive regular security awareness training? We say yes. So everything here is in compliance, basically. I don't want to take any more of your time. So we go back to the scoring, and based on the information that I inputted in the questionnaire tab, the risk tier is showing as moderate because they're pretty much compliant with most of the requirements, even though they're accessing sensitive data. The only risk that they use AI and LLM. So here we will complete the questionnaire by answering the last 5 questions. What this vendor's primary role in your organization? We would say clinical patient care, which is the highest level of access. And then what is the vendor's business criticality? We would say critical. Is the business associate agreement currently executed? We say yes. What is the vendor's system access level? Full administrative access. And why you are assessing this vendor now? We would say annual review. So it's renewal. So as soon as we did that, like, let's just show you. See here, there's nothing showing. As soon as we put the last answer, it automatically gives you the results. So as you could see, it resulted in level C, remediation required. This vendor has PHI access, full administrative access, moderate risk score, and some control gaps, including AI usage with customer data. So the tool says basically fix these specific issues within 30 to 90 days, then reassess, right? Here's the time frame, and here's the suggestion, and here's the additional information that you could find. So based on the logic engine PHI access, full administrative access, moderate risk score of 68. BAA in place, but with some control gaps, including AI LLM usage with customer data. This lands on outcome C, remediation required. And it's like automated results that based on the provided information. So the recommendation is annual review complete, deficiencies required remediation, and address within 30, 90 days, then reassess. That is my decision. It is documented, and I could defend it to anyone who asks, auditors, clients, or leadership. Okay? So basically, BizGuard Light Pro is a one-time purchase for $127. No subscriptions, instant download, works in Excel or Google Sheets, no special software required. Here you will see all the features that this tool provides. The link is in description. So if you're reviewing vendors, whether that's once a month or 10 a year, this tool pays for itself basically on the first assessment. And if you found this video useful, please subscribe. I put out content on vendor risk management, TPRM, and GRC that is actually practical. I built from real experience and not theory. The link is below, and I will see you in the next one.